This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.
Welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I am your host, Corey Nathan, and I really am grateful to have a place to talk about this stuff, to talk about big ideas, to talk about important stuff, important ideas, all these big things, faith, politics. It really matters in our culture. It's about how we live well together. These are the conversations that we're having. It is an honor for TPNR, our program, to be a part of the Democracy Group, a network of podcasts that examines what's broken in our democracy and how we can work together to fix it. And before we start, I have a huge favor to ask. You know, follow, subscribe, depending on what your app asks you to do. But if you haven't given us a rating, if you have, I would hope it's 5 stars if we've earned it, of course. But it would be great if you haven't, give us a rating. If you're digging what we do, it really does make a difference. And even more importantly, write a review. Different apps, it works differently. Like some you can only leave stars, and others you can actually write some comments and stuff. But if you take the time to do that, it really, really does help. If you've already done it, say on Apple, maybe go over to Spotify or Pocket Cast or Podcast Addict and do it again. It really does make a difference. We're starting to get a bunch of downloads, and it's really, really encouraging. But the one thing we need is to get more reviews, and that's the way we get ranked and noticed by the big apps like Apple, Spotify, and others. It all helps get the word out so more people can participate in these conversations. I can keep doing this crazy thing and exploring ways that we can talk about politics and religion without killing each other. And it's conversations like the one we're having today with Dr. Russell Moore. Dr. Russell Moore. Russell Moore is editor-in-chief of Christianity Today and is the author of the forthcoming book, Losing Our Religion, an Altar Call for Evangelical America. Dr. Moore served previously as president of the Southern Baptist Convention's Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, and before that, as the chief academic officer and dean of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, where he also taught theology and ethics. Dr. Moore was a fellow at the University of Chicago's Institute of Politics and currently serves on the board of Becket Law. Is that how we say it? Becket Law?
Mm-hmm, yes.
Yeah, Becket Law. And Becket Law exists to defend the free exercise of all faiths. I love this. From Anglican to Zoroastrian. He also hosts the weekly podcast, The Russell Moore Show, and is co-host of Christianity Today's weekly news and analysis podcast, The Bulletin. And certainly not least among his roles as husband to Maria, dad of 5 sons, and Bible teacher. I love this. Bible teacher at their congregation, Immanuel Church. So Dr. Moore, it's so good to see you again. Thanks for joining us. How you doing?
Oh, doing great. Thanks for having me. I've been looking forward to the conversation.
You bet. I don't mean to start on a sweet sorrow type of a note, but I was just catching up on some of your latest stuff. And you talk so much about your pooch, Waylon, and I saw he passed away. You guys doing okay?
Yeah, he our dog that we've had for 10 years, a little dachshund, but he's kind of been a part of our kids' lives at every step. Died. Actually, we were out of town on vacation. So it's a sad time every time we see his water bowl and, the things we have to put away. He really was a good dog and a part of our lives.
Yeah. When I saw it, one of the first things that came to mind, I know that C.S. Lewis has been a big part of your life and your, formative thinking. Do you remember I think it was in The Problem of Pain. He makes this case for the possibility that dogs go to heaven. So yes, are you a dogs go to heaven guy or no?
I am completely agnostic on that. And I'm happy to be surprised in a good way.
You can run for office someday. That's a great answer. Oh man. But I was thinking of you because I've listened to a few of your, interviews over the last few months, and Waylon comes up so much. So my condolences to you and the family.
Well, thank you. There's a song that I've been listening to a lot called "Someday You're Gonna Leave Me," and it talks about her dog being there with her. And he said, and there's a line that says something along the lines of, you always liked me, that means more than love sometimes.
Mm.
And, that I think that's what a lot of us feel with our dogs.
Man, I wasn't going to go down this road, but you've talked about depression as well. In fact, in your a recent conversation you had on a podcast, your own desert island bookshelf, it came up, depression as a hungering dark. And if I'm being completely candid, I've had some struggles myself in recent weeks and months, and I have these two dogs. What I've tried to explain to folks is that if I can get my feet on the floor at the beginning of a day, it's a good start to kind of getting through that. Yeah. And having my dogs, they almost forced me to to take that first step.
That's right. And there were times when in my life there would be all kinds of chaos going on. And I could come home and know Waylon isn't asking any question about Donald Trump. Waylon isn't worried about any sort of controversy about whatever. He's just glad you're home. And that really does. I think it does force you into a good routine when you wouldn't ordinarily be there.
Yeah. I wasn't planning on talking about this, but, since we came up, when I was a pretty new Christian, maybe 4 or 5 years after I first became a Christian, first grappling with the possibility of this depression. I was ultimately diagnosed manic depressive. But I went to this church that we're in Santa Clarita Valley, where Masters University is. And John MacArthur has a very big presence theologically, culturally. And the first response I got was a very MacArthurian response, which is, you don't have a depression issue, you have a sin issue, which really just exacerbated the whole thing. But I was curious what kind of toolbox you've developed over your life to combat these seasons, whether they're episodes or longer seasons.
Well, there have been seasons that were actual depression, but the more challenging ones were not so much depression as it was external, managing the external, and also finding a way not to talk to myself, for my head to tell me that things were worse than they were. So, for instance, I have a lot of my closest friends know that if they will never text me just praying for you, because that sends me into oh no, what's happened? Right. So they will instead say, nothing's going on. I just happen to think of you and am praying for you, because they're trying to help me with that self-talk. And that's been a big challenge for me, I think.
Yeah. You talk about your new friendship with Beth Moore, who you were asked about often and always had to say no relation. Or I think there was a joke earlier on that, yes, my mother, or something like that. Yeah. And it would put some of the conversation to rest in a joking way. But you've described her as, being when you were going through the thick of it with the SBC, that she was one of those folks that was checking in with you
constantly,
not just praying for you, praying hands, but like actively, checking in on you
constantly. I would have never made it through that time, or I can't imagine making it through that time without her. And I say made it through as though that were past tense. I mean, she's still that way. Yeah. It's one of those things where I look back at some of the things that I said back in, 2006, 2007, about, well, I think that Beth Moore is a gateway drug into feminism, and, all of these just ridiculous things, and realize that guy didn't know what he was talking about. And I think I had this idea, and I think sometimes people do, when they see people who are public figures, sometimes there's just an assumption well, that's not a real person, number one. And number two, the fact that they're so public means they must be shallow.
Mm.
And I think there's an assumption of that. And that was one of the things that I came to see pretty early on in some of the tumult, is that it's not just that Beth Moore was there. It's Beth Moore is really, really brilliant and biblically and theologically grounded.
Yeah, it's you've mentioned a few times when you look at something that you said earlier. In fact, I think it was pretty early in the book you were mentioning. I just made a quick note to myself. You had me at Jaber Crow. But you're describing Jaber's interaction with one of the fellows from that imaginary town who thought all the commies should be rounded up and shot. And Jaber quotes Jesus, "Love your enemies, bless them that curse you." To which Troy, the fella at the barbershop, said, "Where'd you get that crap?" But you described your own. I love the way that you were very candid about your own. You initially thought it was too on the nose or hyperbolic when you first read it 20 years ago, but you don't now.
Yeah. No, I don't now because at the time, I think when I read that, there are some times in Mr. Barry's fiction where the nonfiction bleeds through. And so he's kind of starting to preach, and then you can see him pull back and go back to the fictional world. And I just thought at the time, nobody would actually say that in that way. But in the past several years, I have had pastor after pastor after pastor tell me about that exact scenario.
Yeah.
In which, and what surprises me about that is they will say something, kind of parenthetical about turn the other cheek. And afterward, they'll have somebody coming up and blasting the turn the other cheek weakness. And when the pastor says, well, this is a direct quotation from Jesus Christ. What's surprising to me is not that the congregant says, I was biblically illiterate in that moment, or find some way to save face even. It's that they say, but that doesn't work anymore.
That doesn't work in our time. You make that point and make that starkly in a few different places. One I remember, and I'm not looking at it in front of me, so forgive me if I'm messing it up. But at one point you described the way that some folks see the Roman soldiers who literally put Jesus on the cross as being more of the, more valor in those soldiers than the one who was crucified. So
you look at sometimes. I saw not long ago there was some Christian talking about we need men who are gladiators and willing to. And I stopped and said, gladiators is, there are some things where you can say, I think that Jesus would be opposed to this. And you can make an argument. In this case, we directly know. I mean, Jesus told us the Roman way is not the way directly. And it's really a kind of, it's the temptation we all have. Which is to syncretism and to take whatever culture or subculture or subculture we want to conform to and try to find a Jesus who fits with that. I mean, we all have that temptation, and we're seeing a lot of it, I think, right now.
Yeah. Last time we talked about, my mentorship with Ravi Zacharias. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I took from our conversation, you said, we talked about, one of the thematic verses of the ministry, always be ready to make a defense for the hope that's within you, the apologia verse, but with gentleness and respect. And you said, but that Ravi's failures and his sin doesn't make that any less true, or the word any less true. I was thinking of you as you've gone through these last 8 years, through all that's happened with you, with the SBC. Did you ever, I think you put it at one point, get disillusioned with the church or even start to question your faith?
No. I think, yes, I became disillusioned in the literal sense of losing some illusions. I still have illusions, but I just don't know what they are. But I was disillusioned with some things that really were illusory. But I never came to the point of walking away from the faith or from Jesus or from the church. I mean, that never happened. And the reason it didn't happen is because I had already gone through that as a teenager on a small scale. So if you think about the way that people tell parents, and this is my motto all the time with my own teenage sons, is that they need manageable crises where you're there to walk them through. This is how to deal with a disappointment in a job that you didn't get, or a girl that doesn't like you back, or something like that. Manageable crises. I had a manageable crisis as a teenager when it came to thinking through all of these things. And so then I think I was prepared. I kind of was immunized to some of that. Now, having said that, if I saw some of the things that I saw over the last several years, at not just when I was 15, but when I was, 15 years ago, I don't know that my faith would have survived it. And as a matter of fact, I kind of doubt it would have, which is probably why in the providence of God happened when it did rather than some other time.
Yeah. I think you deal with that at the conclusion of the book, and you deal with it pretty bluntly. I was wondering if you started with that end in mind. I'm looking for the quote right now. And this isn't I'm not giving away any spoilers. It's really a thrust of the book. Here it is. You say the challenge before us is not to make America great again, but to make evangelicalism born again. Maybe, and you go on to say, maybe only when we lose our religion will we be once again amazed by grace. I was wondering if you started with that, or some version of that conviction in mind, and began like the thesis for, or hypothesis that you were working out over the course of the book.
Yeah, I mean, it not that exact wording, because the way I think, I write and am sort of surprised by what I'm writing as I do, because it's a lot of. I've been preparing for things that I'm writing in subconscious ways. That's the best way for me to do it. So it's not the wording, but the actual thought. Yes, because the way that I write in just about every book I've written, it's been working through something, either with myself or with people that I love, and then I'm trying to help. And it's that process of thinking this through. And in this case, it really was that I'm looking at a lot of people who are at a point of perhaps losing their faith, and other people who aren't going to lose their faith, but they're downhearted and they're despairing, in order to say, I think there are a couple of dangers that we can have. And one of those is the attitude that says, well, don't talk about the bad things, just talk about the good things, which leads people to despair, because they say, you're gaslighting me. You're saying I'm not seeing what I'm seeing. And then the other danger is to say, well, I mean, this is the way everything is, just give up. And I've faced both of those temptations. And so it was a way of, it's a way of pointing beyond those two things to something that I think is more biblical.
If you're like me, you're probably a bit frustrated with the state of our political system today. So why does American democracy look the way it does? And how can we make it more responsive to the people it was formed to serve? I'm Simone Leeper, host of Democracy Decoded, a podcast where we examine our government and discuss innovative ideas that could lead to a stronger, more transparent, accountable, and inclusive democracy. Democracy Decoded is a production of Campaign Legal Center. Find us at democracydecoded.org or wherever you get your podcasts.
Yeah. So there was another part at the beginning of the conclusion of the book where you said, and I really appreciate how you reckon it's a hard exercise to go through to reckon with that, with your past and how might this have played out. You say much of what you were talking about your childhood church told me wasn't true. Much of what they assumed turned out to be just what I feared, a mixture of Southern honor culture, American patriotism, Republican politics, white racial backlash, and on and on. And this was the kicker. If I don't face that squarely, I cannot be honest with myself or with you, but everything they told me about Jesus was true. I was wondering, do you have a clear, for lack of a better word, I kind of hate it, but for lack of a better word, do you have an avatar when you're writing? Are you writing for a specific person for this book, or does it change from chapter to chapter?
I don't have somebody that I'm keeping in mind. I do know that there are some people who write and they have someone that they sort of either someone they know or some sort of fictional person. I'm writing this for Dorothy in Dayton or whatever it is. I don't do that, but I do think that I'm attempting to speak to a particular person and will often say, okay, let me talk about this the way I would if I were sitting down with someone, and not just at the surface level, but really, really having a conversation about these things. That's sort of the way I approach it.
And it came up throughout as I was reading the book. It came up often. I want to share with you a little bit. When I was growing up, going to shul with my father and my grandfather, there were often times, depending on the service, that it might be my grandfather. He would poke me and say, "Kor, Shema Kolenu, Shema Kolenu." He thought it was a very important prayer for me in particular to hear. Or my father during the Yom Kippur service. It was always there's a treatment of Ecclesiastes. In that service that he would always poke me and, pay attention a little bit more closely. But it's similar to, going to church, you're listening to a sermon is, so-and-so should really be hearing this right now. Yeah. And that was my experience reading the book. I was wondering if it's almost a challenge. It's like, the people who need to hear this the most, number one, will they read it? And number two, if they read it, will they digest it in a way, any other way other than oppositional? Well,
it's really not written to people who are in opposition. Although, some of them will overhear this in all sorts of directions.
Yeah.
But it's mainly written to the people who are not in opposition, but who are tired and exhausted and maybe despairing, because I think that's the way through. It's not by coming in and saying, okay, let's fix these other people and let's get them where they ought to be. It's instead to say, okay, let's find each other and let's support each other and let's see what new thing God is creating.
Yeah,
I think that's the way through this. So it's really not written to persuade someone, a Christian nationalist or something like that. Although I hope it does. It's more for the person who is saying, "Wait a minute, my church has become a Christian nationalist place," or I'm dealing with a politicized Thanksgiving table that I don't know what to deal with. That's primarily the person it's written to.
Yeah. There's a very subtle form of, I don't know if idolatry, and maybe idolatry is too harsh of a term, but very early on when I became a Christian, I got involved in a couple of ministries, and a good buddy, I got caught up in the thinking of, continuing the ministry. Oh, it's so important. Yeah. There was an incident where one of the leaders of one of the ministries I was involved with got involved in a sticky situation. It was I don't need to go into the details, but it was, it wasn't exemplary of, leaders as described, as prescribed in First Timothy. And we knew it was sticky, but part of the conversation was, well, what about the ministry? What is this going to do? We have to keep, and my buddy said to me, dude, God can still be God without your, without your ministry. Yeah. It's okay. So that comes up.
And I'll tell you, I mean, that we think about that, and I always did, just in terms of the struggle of personal idolatry, as you say. But what I have seen over the past several years is that mentality getting even darker than that in ways that really hurt a lot of people, because you're able to say, well, we see all of these really, really horrible warning signs in whatever ministries there, but the ministry, if we deal with those things, then the ministry is going to collapse. And I mean, I've faced that. I mean, there were so many times over the past several years where I'm trying to think through, okay, I can't really deal with X or Y because we have missionaries who depend on us.
Right.
But I mean, ultimately, you have to say, well, missionaries depend on the truth, and we can't advance the truth with a lie.
Yeah.
And I think so. I think that's kind of always in front of us. And in some way, like everything else, the devil twists things that are good in every case. And in this case, there is a really genuinely good impulse to say, let's protect the institution, in the sense of let's have the institution do what it's supposed to do if we think it's important, and continue on for somebody else in future generations. That's a good impulse, but it can be really, really weaponized in bad ways.
Yeah, no, I remember you referring to some of those, or maybe if it was you, or I was just when I'd read the accounts of the discussions that were happening within the SBC and the ERLC, especially in that last year or so that you were there. I was at the very end of the book, in the acknowledgments, you were talking about three friends, and you say, I could write a whole book about them. I was wondering if you want to take an opportunity to wait. Let me just find my note on it. Sorry, give me 1 second. Here you go. So you mentioned three people from your team at the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission: Philip Bethencourt, Daniel Patterson, and David Prince. And you say a recounting of their courageous leadership and Christ-like conviction would take up a book of its own. So by way of you beginning work on your next book, I was wondering if you wanted to share a little bit about what would be in that book.
Well, David Prince was the chairman of my board and is a courageous pastor in Kentucky that I've known and loved for over 25 years. Daniel Patterson and Philip Bethencourt were my executive vice president and chief of staff, and then later Daniel was also executive vice president. And they started with me as interns at Southern Seminary, and it was one of those things where I kind of had a gut intuition. These are not just really talented and gifted people, but these are centered people as well. They really have grounding and conviction, and at every stage that proved to be not just true, but truer than I thought. And they really, I would not have made it through all of that mess if it weren't for those two. And I say that I wouldn't have made it through the good times if it weren't for those three, actually.
Yeah. On the other side of that, in terms of pleasant surprises, I would imagine that since you were you were flashing early warning signals about Donald Trump. So this is now 8 years ago.
Right.
Put it in context. I was just realizing this the other day. Put it in context. 8 years is as long as the Beatles were playing together. And, that's a long time. But I would imagine that you've been in rooms with folks and even made friends with people that you never would have imagined.
Oh, completely. Completely.
So can you share examples of that and what the circumstances were and what surprised you the most?
Well, I think that what's happening right now is that there's this upending of all of the old sorts of coalitions and alliances, and those things are just blowing up. But there are new things that are configuring, and they're awkward because a lot of times what we want to do is to deal with the old problems instead of the new problems and not aware. And so in my case, that's true both in the Christian space and in the larger space, where there have been people that I previously would have thought, this is somebody who has courage, conviction, is going to stand by what he or she thinks is right, no matter what. And that turned out not to be true. And then there have been other people that I would have never dreamed would have put themselves on the line the way that they did with some of these things. And I think that sometimes when you've been through the same thing together, there's something really wonderful about being with somebody that gets it. And there's an unspoken, you don't even have to go through it. And I've found a lot of people like that. And I've also found, one of my dearest friends is a very secular, progressive guy who will often have the same sorts of frustrations on the left with his crazies as I would on the right with mine. And we could have the same sort of, and can have the same sort of venting conversations to one another, because even though they're completely different worlds, they're actually not. I mean, the same things replicate themselves in various sorts of ways.
Yeah, one of my favorite sets of conversations I've had, not just in the last few weeks or months, but in the entire time I've been doing this thing, is getting Pete Wehner and John Roush together.
Oh yeah, John is Pete, of course, is a very close friend of mine, and John has become a close friend. We get together, a group of us get together every Thursday, and John and I were in Utah at Brigham Young University talking about religious liberty together a few weeks ago. And, John is somebody who is a liberal gay atheist who has no connection to evangelical Christianity at all, but who has this deep respect and curiosity that if we had more of that, we would see a completely different country.
Yeah, he was talking about Tim Keller as restoring his faith in the possibility of faith. So very rich conversations across, and it was the way that Yuval Levin talked about, the way Tim Keller would have conversations with people as if it was a low fence, that you're speaking to a neighbor. And you're just enjoying his company and exploring things together. Yeah,
Yuval and Tim and I are Tim was in a book club together that sort of, it's not really a book club. I mean, it is. we talk about the books, but that's really an excuse
just to get together
and to talk about even, deeper things than just the book, whatever book we're looking at. But Tim would always talk about how striking he found it that Yuval, Jewish, would be on there. We'd be talking about all sorts of Christian things, and Yuval has such a sense of himself and such a charity that there's never a sense of, oh, wait a minute, I'm not included here. And he said, we could learn so much from that. And it's true. I mean, you could see we would have because we'll have people join us as guests sometimes if they've written something that we're reading. And there were a number of times that there were atheists, and I mean really, really atheist sorts of people. And watching the way that Tim would talk to those people was just incredible, because it wasn't just that he was kind and charitable, although he was, and it wasn't just that he knew as much or more than the person he was talking to about the subject. It was that he would actually get to the point of honest, open proclamation of the gospel in ways that were not forced or cheesy. Or I told my wife one time, I said, it's like watching, if you're in a place where nobody's ever seen basketball, and you're watching Michael Jordan and you're saying, I can see what's happening here. I'm not sure if anybody else here can, and how amazing it is. And that's, that's the sort of thing we need.
Yeah. Yeah. I was telling Pete that, boy, I sure would love to be in that book club, but the Groucho Marx, principle kicks in. Any club that would have the likes of me as a member, I become very, very suspicious of.
Well, tonight our gathering is to talk about Tim, and everybody is going to bring things we learned from Tim and talk, because this is the when Tim died, we sort of went dark for a little while, and this is our first time back together, and we're going to honor him.
I was going to ask you, because we did have this nice, John and Pete both came back specifically to do a tribute, because two of the guests that I wrote this list of like dream guests when I first started this program, and Tim Keller was on there and Michael Gerson was on there. So Tim and Pete, John and Pete had such a gift. They came back specifically just to do a tribute to Tim Keller and Michael Gerson. I wanted to ask you if you wanted to share a little bit about Tim. Were you friends with Michael Gerson as well?
Yes, and Mike was part of our book club too. We lost two this year. But
I wanted to ask you in a very specific way that I suspect Tim would appreciate. Maybe share your thoughts about Tim and Mike Gerson, but specifically in such a way that Pete had it all wrong.
Well, I don't think Pete did have it. Does have it wrong.
I'm kidding about that. But
yeah.
But is there? Would you share your thoughts? We've already been talking about Tim Keller, but I'd love for you to share your experience with those two fellas and what they meant to you.
Well, they were very different from each other in all sorts of ways. Mike Gerson was a very earnest sort of person, and when you first met him, you might think he's really serious, and he was serious in the sense of gravity, but he wasn't. But he was kind, and he was thoughtful, and he also was really committed to spiritual formation in himself and in other people, and had courage. I mean, he was a brilliant writer. Now, there's nobody that I think can write a speech or a column like Mike Gerson could, but he also had this just real commitment to the inner life in ways that I don't think people were able to see. Maybe, unless they were close in. And with Tim Keller, I mean, this is somebody who had such confidence in the truth of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ that it transformed everything about the way that he related to people, about the way he led. The reason why he wasn't just another typical megachurch evangelical celebrity figure or whatever, it changed everything. And it gave him this sense of, I was in a room one time where somebody was attacking, kind of very, very harshly criticizing Tim and me. And I could just feel my adrenaline going up and whatever. And I looked over at Tim, and he literally shrugged. And because it was something where he was able to say, okay, I really do believe this, and I'm really confident of where I stand before judgment seat. So it doesn't bother me if somebody else thinks that that's awful,
Right.
That's something I would like to emulate.
Yeah.
More.
And it always surprised me thinking that it might require a more liberal theology and even a liberal set of political positions to do what he was able to do, specifically in New York, and some of his other functions. And yet, dude was a serious Calvinist, wasn't he?
Yeah, and that's why he was effective. One of the reasons why he was effective in New York, because he was a genuinely Orthodox, small o Orthodox Christian, and a confessional Christian. And so I think what Tim conveyed to people is, I'm not afraid of you. You're not my ultimate audience, which gives me the freedom to be able to speak to you honestly. And I think that there were a lot of people in New York who saw in Tim, even if they completely disagreed with him, they were able to say, okay, well, I know he's not selling me something. He really is telling me what he believes. And I think that was the part of the uniqueness of Tim Keller.
Yeah. Yeah. To go back to Mike Gerson just for a quick second, I would often read his columns in tandem with an E.J. Dionne column just to see two different perspectives. And I thought what they both did so well was they would articulate the position of the person that they were arguing against so well and so faithfully. And it made their own arguments for whatever position they were or subject that they were writing about that much more pointed, that much more penetrating and persuasive,
Yeah. And Mike would do that not only with his own writing, but with other people. I mean, he knew how to play devil's advocate in a way that what he was trying to do is to get somebody to really honestly portray another position, not just caricature it and engage with it. And it made whoever he was talking to or helping better. Even if he didn't agree with what they were arguing, their arguments were better.
Yeah.
American democracy has reached a moment of existential uncertainty, with problems bigger than any one administration or headline. My name is James Wallner, and I host the podcast Politics in Question with Lee Drutman and Julia Azari. On our show, we discuss how our political institutions are failing us, and we consider different ideas for fixing them. If you like this episode, you might enjoy Politics in Question. You can find that episode and the rest of our show on Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, and at our website, politicsinquestion.com.
Yeah. So speaking of arguments, I do want to get back to the book just before we start to wrap up. In the chapter "Losing Our Identity," this is one of the most bold statements in my, as I was reading it. You said Christian nationalism cannot turn back secularism because it is just another form of it. In fact, it is an even more virulent form of secularism because it pronounces as Christian what cannot stand before you mention the judgment seat of Christ. Christian nationalism cannot save the world. It cannot even save you. So that's a pretty bold statement.
Well, it's along with a lot of other things, something that would have been obvious in previous times, because what Christian nationalism is doing is saying external conformity is what is Christian. Yeah. If you can get a society to be Christianized, then you have done it, and that is exactly the problem with the old Protestant modernism. It's exactly the problem with the old state church Christendom. We've seen that over and over again, and if you really believe that what the gospel does is to transform people, then Christian nationalism is the worst thing That not just the worst thing for democracy, although it is, and not just the worst thing for world harmony, although it's harmful to that too. It's harmful to the very definition of the gospel.
Yeah.
And so that's why when I'm looking at Christian nationalism, I'm not looking at this is a form of Christianity that just is too harsh or rigid. I'm looking at something that is completely different from Christianity and is masquerading as it. And that's what's really dangerous. If somebody hears the gospel and walks away from Christ because they don't want to follow crucified, buried, resurrected, ascended Jesus, they don't want the gospel of forgiveness of sins and union with Christ, then okay, that happens often. But what's even more tragic than that is somebody who is walking away from Jesus because they see something that is the opposite of him, but pretending to be him. And that's what is so dangerous about this stuff.
Yeah, you mentioned it a couple times where you say a lot of folks are questioning or even walking away from the church, not because they see Jesus and read the Sermon on the Mount and question the truth of that, but they question whether the church that they're going to believes it. So yeah. It's a pretty profound point. I wanted to ask you about one other thing. I listened to part of an episode of a podcast, and it was the whole episode was meant to criticize your address a few years ago at the Gospel Coalition about how we should treat people who identify as transgender. And this fellow played only short segments of your talk and then went on. And as he played these short segments, I was like, that makes sense. That's thoughtful. but then he went on to attack, and it was just this certain form of, it was like this narcissistic, misogynistic venom for transgender folks. And anybody who shows empathy was a big trigger word for this fellow. What I was wondering was if you ever try to engage with folks like that. I won't name the show, but the way he describes his own show is idol smashed, abominations named, the word of God proclaimed, and that sort of thing. Do you ever engage with your critics, specifically critics within the church?
I don't engage with that sort of critic.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
Because I don't think that. I think usually that sort of trollish kind of engagement, it's not worth engaging, and it also isn't helpful to me to even know about. So I don't even look to that. Now I talk a lot to people who are good faith disagreement with me on something. I mean, that happens all the time, but that's an entirely different thing than.
Yeah. I was so curious. I love your, you were so kind. You shared one of my desert island bookshelves in your newsletter a few months ago. And I loved that recent conversation. We have a lot in common, the Wendell Berry and Robinson books, and Berry in particular, when I was first introduced to his work in 2006, 2007, and Hannah Coulter, I think, was the first one, and Jaber Crow, we already mentioned. What was so helpful about those books is he treats a life. It's obviously the imaginary circumstances that he's created, this imaginary world that's close enough to home, but the treatment of a life. And it reminded me, as we were going through some really hard financial struggles in those years, that this is, we'll come out the other side, and it is possible there's, premature death and stuff like that. But, life, somehow reading that, it just reminds me that, we'll come out the other side and life will continue to go on, Yeah.
And that's true with Barry. It's true with Marilyn Robinson as well. You have what would seem to be very ordinary people. So it's not the same as a biography of some conqueror or military hero or whatever, very ordinary people. And it does give you this sort of bird's eye view of a life that does remind you that that the storyline of a life is encountering difficulty, and that's part of what it means for life to be gift. I think that's true. That's also one of the ways that Barry's work and Robinson's work has been so helpful to me.
How do you read? You also mentioned collections of poems and poetry. How do you read poetry?
How do I read it?
Yeah, yeah. Is there a certain way that you read it that it's able to, what's the word that you've used? Inhabit, inhabit those imaginary worlds, or inhabit the stories, inhabit the imagery. Is there a certain way that you read it to inhabit that work?
Oh, no, because I know people who are experts enough that they're able to have a kind of template. This is how I'm engaging with the poem. I don't have that. I read what I like, and I come back to what I like, and sometimes I don't even know why I like it, and sometimes I don't even know. I mean, I know it sounds like I'm in book club all the time, but I had another book club that met all through the pandemic. We would have this socially distanced outside meeting around a fire, going through very slowly T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets. And there were so many things hidden in each of those poems. I mean, I've always loved them, and particularly East Coker, but there were all kinds of things I'd never thought about until we were reading it together. And so it's not, I don't have some sort of complicated mechanism for, I just read what I like.
It's because you have a palette, I guess, that like an intellectual, imaginative palette that's ready to absorb. I have to do it much more methodically, actually. And it reminds me of when I was studying theater when I was in my late teens and early 20s, and Stanislavski has this prescription of, approaching the material. The first read through of a play an actor or director does has to be very, just kind of separate yourself as if you're just the audience taking it in. And then the second read through is much more methodical, and you're starting to break down moments. Or in the case of poetry, I'll do something similar where I'll read it much more mechanically, and I'll really try to sit with an image, sit with a phrase, and really try to process that and understand and picture that. And then by the third time through, I'm able to read it all over again, but with a much greater depth. The collection, I forgot what it's called off the top of my head, Barry's Sabbath poems. Yeah, so I did it with that one.
Yeah, and I think I do something kind of like that, but not with intentionality or consistency. It's more that because I will skip over any poem that doesn't speak to me in the moment, and that's to my detriment, because there are a lot of things that if I really did the work on it, I probably would speak to me. But I usually don't. I pay attention to the ones that do. And those are the ones that I come back to a lot. I mean, for instance, Wendell Berry's "Do Not Be Ashamed" it has been a really important poem in my life over the last several years, because it seemed to put words to something. And I think this is what, at least for me, that's what poetry does, whether it's actual poetry or song lyrics, which I think are it's the same sort of idea. They put words to things that you're experiencing, but you don't know how to communicate them. You don't know how to put words to them, and they do that. And so the poems that speak to me the most are the ones that are dealing with certain aspects of life that one just can't find words for. So I mean, right. when you look at Four Quartets, the meaning of time, and that's what really speaks to me, are those things.
Yeah, great theologians can do that for me as well. I think of Heschel and his dealing with time. Yeah. It's his book on the Sabbath, actually. So I want to ask you I call it the TP&R question, talk politics and religion question. What do you think each of us can do to be able to share space with, have better conversations with, even nurture relationships with people across our differences? So people who think differently than we do, have different beliefs than we do, get their news from different sources than we do. How can we be better at talking politics and religion without killing each other? Or is it even possible?
Yeah, and I think the main way that it's possible is for for first of all, for you to have an identity that's bigger than a particular set of arguments. So, for those of us who are Christians, an identity in Christ, we have a sense of ourselves such that when we have a disagreement over a set of issues, even really important issues, it's not an existential threat. And I think that that's the primary reason that so many arguments turn as bloody as they do. And the second thing is have confidence in what you actually believe. And I'm not talking about those things that you would say. I mean, there are all kinds of things that I would say, I think this, but I'm kind of 51-49 on it. And I'm not really sure. Dogs in heaven, those sorts of things. But there are things where if you have real confidence in what it is that you believe, then you're not in this sense of siege. When someone challenges that. And I think a key part of that too is to actually believe that people can be persuaded. Which doesn't mean, we'll double down on trying to persuade them. If you know that people can be persuaded and that minds can change, including your own, it humanizes the conversation in a way that doesn't happen if what you're doing is separating people out into good guys and bad guys. I mean, a Christian view of the world says that everybody's both hero and villain. Right. Everybody's created in the image of God. Everybody's fallen. And so if we know that, then we don't have to have this sense of, I'm on the side of the people who are all good, and they're on the side of the people who are all evil, whoever they are, because then you ultimately start to see that your side is not all good. And sometimes you see that their side is not all evil, and that can throw people. Well, then I don't even know who I am anymore.
Right. Yeah. There's a few things in there that really resonate. One is the possibility that folks can be persuaded, even oneself, leaving open that possibility that I can be persuaded. Monica Guzman, they just had this great conference in Gettysburg for the Braver Angels, and Mani's, her book was, I never thought of it that way. Leaving open the possibility that you'll have these intuit moments. I never thought of it that way. Because I think folks are more ready to be persuaded if they think that they can persuade you on some things. But I think the other side of that, though, and I've kind of realized this recently, is that, I have to recognize when I'm in a conversation that's not really a conversation that's defined by we're inquisitive and we're curious, as much as interrogation to the point where we can then classify this person and then characterize or mischaracterize them in order to demonize them. So just kind of the separating the wheat from the chaff in that way is a good. Yeah,
and that's kind of why it goes back to the question you asked earlier about some podcast or what have you. I don't ever do, and I get invited to do these things where I want you to debate so-and-so, about whatever. I mean, about atheism or about whatever. I don't ever do that. And the reason for it is because A, I'm not very good at it.
Yeah.
Because B, I don't think it's very productive. I think that sort of thing usually does end up in we're grappling to see who's best and who's smartest here. For me, if I have an understanding of the way I actually change my mind, in every time that I've ever changed my mind, it has never been because I'm at the end of a 30-minute argument and I surrender.
Yeah.
It's usually this longer process, and usually both in my own life and with a lot of people that I've seen and known, the closer I get to being persuaded of something, the harder I'm going to kick against it. for a while. And so you have that understanding with other people so that you say, I'm not going to give up on you. And I'm also going to realize that you're a complicated person and you're not just whatever your views are.
Yeah.
Neither am I. And that I think often leads to, once people can actually say, okay, I don't have to be the representative of my group or my viewpoint. I can sit down and actually talk human being to human being. That's where I think the really productive change happens.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Some of my favorite conversations I've had in recent months has been with folks, pals, acquaintances that are still, big MAGA guys. But, it was a longer conversation, and a lot of the conversation was about them and their life and how they, what happened in their life to arrive at some of the positions that they have. And you're right. It's like this guy can't be boiled down to, his gun rack and a bumper sticker that says, "Let's go, Brandon." He's an interesting, at the end of the day, I might disagree with a bunch of things, but interesting guy with an interesting life story. And we came to enjoy each other's, strange as it may seem, I came to enjoy hanging out with him for a bit. So,
yeah.
Starting to wrap up here. Any questions for me?
I'm really interested. You alluded to it earlier about depression and the situation that you went through with the MacArthurite kind of counsel. I wonder what has been most helpful for you?
Boy, it's been a 15, 16 year journey. And I developed a toolkit early on. I did try pharmaceuticals, and I just didn't. I had a lot of side effects, but not the desired ones. So over the course of about a year to 18 months, I weaned off of the pills, and I did develop several habits. One was I would start. This might sound corny to some folks, especially folks that listen that aren't particularly religious. I would start with scripture. I would start my day reading a little, whether it's a chapter or a couple of chapters, and whether I was even absorbing it in the morning or not, it was kind of like, okay, get the word in. It's like you get up and you have some tea or you have breakfast or whatever. I started with some of the word. I also, in addition to that, would have. I'm not a traditional prayer, like get on my knees next to my bed and pray. I was never good at that. Maybe it's because I grew up Jewish and we always had structured prayers. So I'm like, what's the prayer? But what I did do was I developed a writing habit. So I have a couple of like rules or structures. The one in the writing is just a mindset of if I'm talking to anyone, I'm talking to God. Right. Mm-hmm. Because I feel like even if I'm talking to myself, if there's any entity that knows me even better than that I cannot BS with, it's God. So I just want to have a conversation with God and allow the possibility that maybe God is speaking to me through the writing. And it also, what it does is the writing slows my thoughts down enough to be able to find articulation or shape to them. Because a lot of times especially being on both sides of the manic depressive, sometimes a lot of times the manic parts of the cycle are awesome. I get so much done, It is a little dangerous because, sometimes there are proclivities that dominate, that are the themes, if you will, of those manic periods. But a lot of times the exercise is in just slowing it down. So those were a couple things, and then reading good material. Like I see you have. I have book envy. Your library that I see behind you, but like reading great authors. We mentioned Pete and John, and they've had recent books that have helped me make sense of what in the world is going on. As well as poetry or good fiction. You mentioned Dostoevsky on your bookshelf. Just that section. Where he's talking to a devil type figure, a Satan type figure. So reading the Bible, reading. And believe it or not, about a year and a half ago, exercise. I'll go out for a walk. We're about a half mile from Horse Trail. So just getting out, like I said, just getting my feet on the floor is when I'm in the depressive parts of those cycles. It's hard, man. It's like the air is not air; it's quicksand. So just getting that first step, But the last thing I'll say is I did discover I was hesitant to try meditation for a long time because of my theological convictions as a growing up Jewish and now as a Christian. But I discovered it's just breathing. And there's this one particular exercise called noting, and you described a version of it. Noting is a thought enters in and you note it, and you can sort of name it like, oh, that's an emotion or that's a negative thought. And then you let it pass, so that it doesn't occupy you. It isn't you. It's a separate thing. And if you can do that, it helps with distraction. It helps with some of the darkness. So anyway, that's a longer answer to your question, but those are some of the tools that I've developed.
That makes me think of the poet Malcolm Guite, who did an interview with my friend Cherie Harder last year, I think it was. I think this is where he said this. He was talking about a time when he found it very difficult to pray. And all he wanted to do was read poetry. And he said what he started doing was saying, I'm just going to read this poetry to God. And actually began praying that way. Wow. And that really changed the way I thought about some of those dry periods. Yeah,
that's awesome. So how can folks find you online or more about the podcasts and find the book is coming out in early August?
Well, now July 25th.
Oh, great. Oh, that's the day before my birthday.
Oh, okay.
So we'll release this episode that week. I'll hold on to it. I'm sure you'll have a lot of interviews coming out at that point. But so how can folks find you and all the great work that you're doing?
Well, there's the Russell Moore Show. They can listen to the podcast or the Bulletin. Mike Cosper and Nicole Martin and I do every Friday. That's talking about things that are going on in the news at the moment. And my Twitter handle is @drmoore, and my Threads handle is @RussellMoore.
Awesome. That is great. Anything important I forgot to ask you?
No, I don't think so.
All right. We covered a lot of ground today. So nice to see you. It's
you as well.
Such a treat to get to hang out with you a little bit. And, I hope it's not the last time.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
You bet. And as always, if you dig what we're doing here, hit that subscribe button or follow button. Like I said earlier, if you could take the time to leave a review and comments, it really does help. And give me a shout online. I am @Corey S. Nathan on all the socials, even Threads. That's Corey with an E and S as in Sam @Corey S. Nathan. Now go talk some politics and religion. And Dr. Moore will appreciate this with gentleness and respect. And have a great week.